Let us talk about control of the pituitary gland by the hypothalamus. It'd be useful to kind of look at a three-dimensional perspective of the hypothalamus. Here we have, let me just show you, it's right in there. I'll show this again. When we look at the brain as a whole, the entire structure that we kind of recognize as the brain is mostly cerebrum. Back here is the cerebellum. And this purple stuff in the center here is called the diencephalon. All this stuff, well, back here is the brainstem. But up here, this is the diencephalon. And you see this little cherry hanging down here? That is your pituitary gland. I'll show it one more time. Little stem here called the infundibulum. That little cherry there at the end of the stalk is the pituitary gland. And then what we're able to see here is that there's a hypothalamus, the structure that is directly above the pituitary gland. I like this video for a number of reasons. For one thing, it shows you that nice three-dimensionality so that you can kind of really get a perspective of what we're dealing with here. But the other reason I like it is that it shows what the hypothalamus really actually looks like. Okay, pituitary gland, infundibulum, and right above that is the hypothalamus, and there it is. There is the pituitary gland, infundibulum, hypothalamus. And now we recognize that the hypothalamus is not just one brain structure, but rather a whole bunch of different ganglia inside of there that allow for different things to happen. And so this story becomes much less confusing if you recognize that the hypothalamus is not one thing inside of the brain, but rather a whole number of ganglia that each have their own little role, and they each have their own substances, for example, that they release, or they each have their own job to do. So the hypothalamus is not one thing, but rather about, dozens of things inside of there that it does. A very complex part of the brain. So what we're going to be talking about here is that the hypothalamus is the endocrine engine, and that it sends signals down through two different pathways to the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary lobe. There it is. So let's take a closer look at that. I'm just going to quickly say that the hypothalamus does interact with the posterior pituitary lobe. Now, the posterior pituitary lobe we're going to be talking about more specifically down the line. We're not even really discussing that. Believe it or not, inside of this pituitary gland, which by the way is about the size of a pea, or maybe slightly larger than a garden pea, there are actually two different structures inside of there that are very different from each other. The posterior pituitary lobe is called a lobe because it's not actually a gland. The anterior pituitary gland is a gland because it manufactures and releases its own products. The posterior pituitary lobe does none of that. So I'm just showing you that so that you understand the posterior pituitary also has a connection with the hypothalamus, which we will be talking about down the line. For now, we are going to be talking about the anterior pituitary gland specifically and that communication there. So just so you know, the posterior pituitary lobe is called the neurohypophysis, N-E-U-R-O, neurohypophysis, and the anterior pituitary gland is called the adenohypophysis, or adenohypophysis. The anterior pituitary gland is made of glandular tissue. So just to review, this is from a couple videos ago. Name the three ways in which glands are signaled to release hormones. Do you remember? We're talking about the upstream signal here. We're thinking about the release of hormones at the level of the glands. What are the three stimuli for endocrine gland release? Pause the video and answer the question. Okay, if you answered humoral, neural, and hormonal, perfect, well done. So what we're going to be concentrating on today is the idea of the hormonal stimulus, the hormonal stimulation of hormone release. And this is what it looks like. We have a hormone that is released by one particular structure that releases the hormone into the bloodstream that then in turn interacts with different structures in the body, and that is called a tropic hormone. Remember, tropic hormone means maintaining or maintenance hormone. It's the manager. It's the one that decides that other things are going to happen. So we have these hormones that are released In this case, by the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland does release all of the tropic hormones that we discussed in this class, and this in turn allows for these particular tissues and more to respond. The thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex, the gonads. Okay, so this is a hormonal stimulus, allows for these target cells, which in this case are other endocrine glands, to then go on in turn and release their product, to release their hormones that they themselves manufacture. So hormonal stimulus is a hormone release caused by another hormone, in this case a tropic hormone. Okay, so let's take a look at how this actually starts off happening in the first place. What we're looking at in this picture is a particular vascular connection that is very important. Vascular connection just means blood supply going, from one place to another. So this vascular connection is shown here. It is called the hypophyseal portal system. There it is. And you're going to have three parts to this. Up above here, it's called the primary capillary plexus, right in there. So all of this little network of blood vessels right there is called the primary capillary plexus. Next, you have what's called the hypophyseal portal veins. Hypophyseal portal veins. And what these are, what the name portal suggests, it's a door that connects between the primary capillary plexus, and guess what this one down here is called? The secondary capillary plexus. So we have a primary capillary plexus up here. As you can see, it's right at the top of the infundibulum. It's very close to the hypothalamus, so it's right up there. And then the secondary capillary plexus, you will note, is a crisscrossing network of blood vessels that actually kind of circulates blood through the anterior pituitary gland itself. The word plexus means a crossing or a network of structures. All right, so it's important to note that the blood supply originally comes from this structure called the superior hypophyseal artery, which is a derivation of the anterior, the internal carotid artery, which is the main conduit of blood going up into the head. These big, thick cables that go up through your neck into your brain. Anyway, so this superior hypophyseal artery comes from there and brings blood into this system in the first place. And there will be a vein that travels out of here that allows for the product to be transported from here. Okay, so the idea here is okay. So our primary capillary plexus then brings neuropeptides from the hypothalamus itself. Neuropeptides is a word that we're going to use for products that are produced inside of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is not a gland, so it doesn't technically produce hormones. So we're going to call them neuropeptides. However, the hypothalamus is going to release these neuropeptides into the primary capillary plexus, where they will then go down through, you guessed it, the hypophyseal portal veins and interact with the secondary capillary plexus. Here we go, portal vein, secondary capillary plexus. Now, those neuropeptides that were released from the hypothalamus will begin to circulate through the secondary capillary plexus, which just to remind you, is making its way through the entirety of the anterior pituitary gland. And in turn then, the anterior pituitary gland will release hormones to the general circulation. And in this case, almost all of the hormones, it could be argued that all of the hormones we're discussing here are considered tropic hormones. So they are tropic hormones, released by the anterior pituitary gland, that allow for other glands to release their hormones. So what I would suggest doing is just going ahead and copying this into your notebook. And what we're going to do, and you can look all this stuff up on your own, nothing's stopping you, but we're going to go through this entire figure together, and we're going to go through an interesting case study, and we're going to talk about all the different, we're going to talk about negative feedback mechanism, and just the specifics of this particular system. So at the top of your page, you want to say hypothalamus, in the middle, say anterior pituitary, and on the right, you want to say target, and then just copy these arrows exactly as they are, included the dotting lines. You can kind of gauge what they are. If you kind of do the reading, go through the textbook, you'll be able to figure out what all of these little marks mean. And then I would encourage you to not just memorize, of course, the abbreviations for these hormones and these neuropeptides, but rather go ahead and write out the entire word.